Today's Daf Wednesday is a new Masechta Horayos Daf Beis Amud Aleph. It is actually one of the smallest Masechtas in Shas, but also it's quite difficult. Number of Gersayos, and basic theme is what happens if you are blindly following the Chachamim, the Rabbanim, and you go ahead and and they paskin wrongly. Are you liable or not? And on the other hand, if you know that their psak is wrong, you cannot say, "Oh, it's a rabbi's problem; it's not my problem." It doesn't work that way. If you, especially, you know that the hechsher is very dubious and very questionable in a restaurant that you go to, but then you say, "Well, they put a tu'ud over here; it's their responsibility." That doesn't work. If you know that it's not that there's problems, then you can't say you're relying on the rabbanon. So let's learn the Mishnah here. The Mishnah part 1. The Bezdin ruled that you should that you can be over, you can transgress one of the mitzvahs in the Torah. For example, they ruled that treifa fats or blood is kosher. Now there are 3 different possibilities. Bein she'asu va'asa iman, whether you all did it together. So then for sure, you can't be held liable. You follow the Chacham, you're with them. They did it first and you followed afterwards. You didn't do it together, but still you based yourself on the Chacham. And possibility number 3 is Bein Shaloyasu. The Rabbanan did not proceed to eat that treifa of fats, but they passed so and you followed. For us, and you did it in all of these 3 cases. Potter, you are potter because you relied on the view of the Bezdin. Now, this is the view of our Mishnah. It doesn't matter whether the vast majority of the people follow the Bezdin. It doesn't matter whether only a minority of the people. It doesn't matter if you're the only one who followed the Bezdin. According to our Mishnah, you are potter because you relied on the Bezdin. Part 2. What happens if Hoyda Bezdin, but the Yoda Achad Man Shato, but you are a member of the Bezdin and you knew that they're wrong? Or you tell me you're not a member of the Bezdin, you're a student, but you're suitable to Paskin. Same idea. You know that they did the wrong thing, but you still followed what they said. And again, the 3 scenarios: whether they did it with you, whether they did it at first and you followed, and they didn't do it at all, so you did it. But the common theme here is that you said you relied on the Bezdin, knowing that they were wrong. Here you're chayiv according you weren't relying on the Bezdin. The obvious question is: so you knew the Bezdin made a mistake. Why is that called a shaygig? Why is that called inadvertent? And you bring a carbon? It's deliberate. And for deliberate averos, you don't bring a carbon. The Gemara will discuss that. Then the Mishnah concludes, wraps it all up, gives a ruling, and every time the Mishnah gives a ruling, obviously wants to add something, which the Gemara will discuss as well. This is the rule. If you're relying on yourself, in other words, you know the Bezdin is doing the wrong thing, then chayiv. Then you are chayiv. Why the Mishnah has to say that again? We just said that. The Mishnah obviously teaching you a new halacha, which we'll see in the Gemara. The Bezdin, but if you're relying on the Bezdin, you are potter. Again, why does the Mishnah have to say that when the Mishnah said that opening case? We'll see. Says the Gemara, first of all, Shmuel says, when Bezdin gives a ruling, sometimes it could be academic and sometimes it's a ruling. Is there a difference to the way Bezdin words it before we say, this is called a ruling? We did have a similar Gemara in Sanhedrin Davav Beis, where the Gemara here doesn't bring it down, where the Gemara talks about when a Bezdin gives a ruling, when is you could no longer make a pshara, when is considered a ruling? When they said that this is how, one guy's guilty, one is innocent, or they say, go out and pay the person, go do something about it. So says the Gemara. First, Shmuel said, Bezdin is not chayiv until they give a ruling. What's the ruling? Not to say, this is permitted. That's sufficient. Rav Dimi ben Hadoy says, Ad sheyemru lehem, they have to say not only that mutarim that is permitted, but they have to go one step further. Mutarim atum lasas. You can not only permitted, but you can go ahead and do it. My timer, prior to that, it's not considered as if they gave up sak. Okay, so it has to be that you want to go ahead and do it. Now, right now, the Gemara, the way the Rishonim learn is that Dimi is only explaining Shmuel a bit further. Now we'll bring a number of proofs to this din that a psak is not a psak until you actually tell them go out there and conduct yourself as that's the final ruling. We will learn that let's say a Zakin Mamre that rebels against the Bezin and he passes against the entire Bezin, and then he goes back home and he continues repeating it. When is it considered his ruling against the Bezin? So it said like this: Chazalira, he went back to the city. Shona Velimad, he went back and repeated Kederech Shalimad Potter. If he says this is how this is the theory, Potter. But if he said Hoida Lasses, go ahead and you can conduct yourself and do this, then chayiv. So clearly a psak is not until you tell them to do it. I'm not even learn. Hoydrula Bezin told this woman that they thought her husband died and they said, go out there and marry again, right? Turned out to be the husband's alive, Bezin made a mistake. But instead of marrying again, and they said, Hoydrula Bezin lehinase. It's not enough the Bezin said, okay, we accept your husband died. Bezin said, go out and get married. Again, they're telling her to conduct as if the psak is final. Then the kilkul, and she instead she went and had znus, extramarital, then chayav carbon. Then she's chayiv in a carbon. You can't say that you follow Bezin because you didn't follow Bezin, even though the Bezin made a mistake, but that's not what you did. She only gave permission to get married. Again, a psak is only when they tell her to go out and do something. I'm going to be now. Third proof. We learned how to Bezin lava. I'm going to be some of it says now Mishnah clearly Bezin paskin lava to go out there against transgress when the mitzvah was potato. So you have to go and do it. Sula Midi, no longer need a proof. We had a similar Gemara in Avodah Zarah. Once you say that's it, it's final. Sula Midi, no longer discussion. Ikadamni, strong proofs. Another version was that Shmuel, that's actually an argument between Shmuel and Avdimi. Shmuel's the one who said, Ein Bezin Chayav and Achir Lamitor Lasis. Avdimi Adoi is the one who said, Afil Mutadim at Nigmara. Avdimi says that even just saying that if this is permitted is sufficient. And now Abaye, the three proofs he brought before, will now be questions addressed to Avdimi. Abaye, but look now how we did in this way. It says, Chazalira, he went back to the city, the Zakim Mamre Beshana, and he taught it the Limit Limit. Or he just taught it as an academic study, potter, only if he instructed them that this is what you should do, then you chayv. Proof that it's not considered psak until you tell them go out there and do it. Another proof that we had before, we didn't learn this. They told her to get married. Again, they told her to get married. And she went and she did extramarital chayevis big carbon. They told her only to get married. Again, go out and do it. I'm going to be for a third one from our mission. It says Bezin Lava, Sulay Midi, no longer need any proof. Okay. Then the mission said, Vaholach Hayochid. The Yochid went, the Osa Shagig Apiem, and when Shagig Apiem, and Taisha says, by the way, this is a general rule when the Rav Paskas they have to tell you, and that is permitted, but go ahead, you can go ahead and do it. And the Gemara we had in Gemara about Basa where it says, Ein lemeidin halacha. You don't learn halacha al pi maisa doesn't mean that Bezin tells you go ahead and do something that's not a psak. No, on the contrary. What it means is that if you saw a story, you heard a story about a certain Rav behaving in a certain way, you can't just rely on that because you don't know all the details and all the nuances, and maybe with a slight variation, and that's why the Rav behaved the way he behaved. You can't just follow that blindly. You have to find out more of what it's all about. Says the Gemara. Interesting, the Taisus in general and this Masechta here are very different than ordinary Taisus. There are a lot of Chakiris and all interesting comments. Anyway, the Gemara continues. Now Yachim went and he did a Shagig al Piyam. Now it seems to repeat itself. First of all, it says that he did a Shagig al Piyam. Isn't that redundant? Just say he followed what they said. Or he did a Shagig. What's the repetition? Shagig al Piyam. So we're going to have now, there's two possibilities. One is blindly followed the Rabbanim. They said that treifa fats is kosher and you ate treifa fats. But there's another step. What happens? You went ahead and you ate thinking that it was kosher fats. You thought it was shuman. Turned out to be that it was chaylev. It was treifa fats, but this is the treifa fats the Rabbanim said is kosher. Now over here, how do we treat that? It's not really al piyam. You didn't eat this thinking that the bezin allowed it because you thought it was kosher. But at the end of the day, it's a shegi because even if you would have found out that this was treifa fats, you still would have continued eating it because the Rabbana said it's kosher. How do we view that? Do you bring a korban chatas or do we say it's sort of in between? Maybe we can suggest that this is called al piyam. So that's what we're going to have in the Gemara here. The Venisna was al piyam shegi. Let me say add the word shegi. Amar Rava says there's two ways to learn the Gemara here. So Rava says that shegi la'asuye come to teach you hoyru bezin shechela muter. Bezin went ahead and said that treifa fats are muter and a salav lecheva shuman, and you thought that it was kosher fats trying to be treif. But Achli potter, you are potter. And Alpia means Alpia mamish. Alpia means you follow blind with the Chacham said. And Shagig adds another layer that even though you didn't follow the Chacham, you thought it was kosher fats, you're still all right. You don't have to bring carbon. Economics, another version. Omar Rava says Rava Shagig Alpiem who the potter. The other version is Rava says all the way around. The only time you are potted is if it was Shagig Alpiem, if you followed exactly what the Chacham said. But if you swap by mistake trade fast for kosher, then it's not potter because you didn't rely on the bezin. You made a shagig. Says the so they have two opinions. What Rava said. In fact, the Gemara says that Milsa the Pshita Rava in this version that Rava is so convinced one way or another. Rava Chama actually asked the question, a query. He didn't know which way to go. The boy Rava Chama heard the bezin ruled this in mutter, and it's chav lebeshumin, and then by mistake you ate kosher fats. You thought it was kosher fats, turned out to be treif. What's it din? So we have another version. Omar Rava says two versions of what Rava said. One version is Rava said, Tashma coming here. It says now Mishnah Holach Yachid va'asa Shegig Alpim. If a Yachid went and he did a Shegig and Alpim, what's a double Dutcher? Shegig Alpim, lovely, why double? Lav Lasuya come to teach you that even if it's not just Alpim, it was a Shegig, a step removed. Hoyde Bezin Shechela Mut. Bezin said that treif fats is mut. When it's Chavla Chela B'Shivit, and you may swap to kosher and treif. But Achla you ate it still potted. You potter. Says the Gemara, how do you know? Maybe the Mishnah means Dilma Shagig Alpiyim, but maybe the Mishnah is trying to bunch the two together. It's not two separate cases. You learning Shagig or Alpiyim. No, maybe it means that when is it considered a Shagig? Only if Alpiyim. You followed exactly what they said, and that's when you are potter from a carbon because you relied on the bezin. I want to but you didn't rely on the bezin. You thought it was kosher fats. Maybe chayiv. No proof one way or the other. And he could have another version, the same idea, but there Rava was coming up with a different conclusion, and more or less the same question, how you know which way to learn. And that is, Omar Rava said, Toshma, come in here. The Yachi went and did Shegig according to them. My lab, Shegig Alpim, it's one case. Shegig, what's a Shegig Alpim? Who the potter? You follow them blindly. Avon is Chalif Lechele B'Shumah, but you thought it was treif kosher, and you ate treif achlu chayiv. Then maybe you chayiv. So more again, how do you know? Maybe it's two cases. Dilma oy Shegig oy Alpim. Says the Gemara, it seems that's actually a machlekes. Big plukte. It says it's a machlekes between Rav and Rabbi Yechid. Bezin ruled that treif fats is mutter, and when this chalif lechele b'shum, you thought it was kosher fats, and you ate treif. And Rabbi Yesi says, Rav says, potter. You are potter at the end of the day, even if you would have found out that it's treif fats, you still would have continued eating. So you are potter, you're relying partially on the bezin. And Rabbi Yechid says chaye because at this juncture you had no idea this has any relationship to bezim sak. Basically, it was a question. It says in the pasuk me'am ha'aretz that if somebody goes ahead, or a member of Am ha'aretz, very interesting with Rashi. We say today that Am ha'aretz means an ignoramus. It's fascinating because in the Torah, Am ha'aretz actually is quite complimentary. There, Am ha'aretz, Rashi says there's Am shebeginner Nivras Haaretz, and the whole world is created for these people. And it's interesting when and how did the word Am Haaretz, which is supposed to be a complimentary term and description, become so negative? Not sure. But in the Mishnah already, Am Haaretz is already negative, and don't know how it transpired that it changed. From one extreme to the other extreme. But anyway, the Pasuk says, "Am Haaretz." If a member of the Am Haaretz did an avera that he shouldn't have done, and they were guilty, they did an avera. So prat lemuma. So the Tanakama says, the Tanakama prat lemuma, a one-off. But if somebody habitually commits averas, a mummer, then they don't bring a karbachatas. It doesn't matter what they are a mummer for. Could be a different aveda altogether than the aveda he did right now, which was inadvertent. It doesn't matter. If you are a mummer, we don't accept your carbon. And Reb Shimon ben Yosef, so we don't need to learn from that pasuk. It says clearly in pasuk, and another pasuk similarly. It says that Ashaloisa said he did an aveda, even though it talks about the nasi, but it says Ashaloisa said he shouldn't have done this aveda. Bish Goga. And he sinned, or if he found out and they bring a carbon. In other words, only if you found out and as a result of that you're filled with remorse. Hashav midiyase maybe carbon. Now you're filled with remorse, you'll never do it again. Okay, bring a carbon. If he doesn't really care, then ain't maybe carbon ashgogase. So Muna doesn't rain carbon. The Gemara later on already said, what's the difference between these two opinions? The difference is, what about your mummer to another Aved altogether? If you learn from Shavi, they'll say, maybe for this Aved, you'll do Tshuva. Not just because you did one Aved doesn't mean you do another Aved. But if you convert it because you're a mummer, then I don't care why you're a mummer. You don't bring a Karma Chatas. Now, if the only time is according to Reb Shimon, if you Shav Mediose, had you known you would do Tshuva, in the case of treif fats, that you ate kosher fats thinking it was kosher, turned out to be treif. Even if you found out it was treif, because Bezdin ruled that treif fats is kosher, you still would have continued eating. There's no shav midiyasei. So the chaydev, there's no shav midiyasei. You won't bring a carbon. How can Rav Yechina say that you chayiv a carbon in a case where you thought it was kosher fats turned out to be treif? So you weren't really relying on Bezdin. You bring a carbon. There's no shav midiyasei. Even if you found out, you wouldn't have done tshuva. The yimisa halash shav midiyasei. Papa says, kasav Rav Yechina holds. Kiva de chimisiyad l'beidina. Shomid Yos is not only you, it's also the cause of the Shegig. Who were the cause of the Shegig? The Bezdin. Had the Bezdin found out that they made a mistake, they would have retracted. So there would have been Shomid Yos there. And then you yourself also would have retracted. You wouldn't have eaten the tray for fat. So therefore, Shomid Yos. But that's only in the case where you thought it was kosher fats, to be treifs, because you sort of a step removed. But if you knew it was treifa fats and you relied totally on the bezin, then that's not. Then you're totally potter, as the Rishonim explained. Even though had bezin would have found out they made a mistake or changed their mind, it doesn't matter. You 100% relied on the bezin, and therefore you are potter. My time I'm going to potter bishgoga. Actually, kulam bishgoga achas. Sorry, I skipped a line. Yeah, I'm gonna pop a sorry, big hold keep in the chimis yadl, but the Ben would have found out how they would have retracted. Unami had the bay also retracted. So I'm just going to be called Shav the Yosei. The chayiv, and therefore you are chayiv because you do tshuva. Omar Rava says, but Moide Rav will concede. She'ena maslim v'rei tzibur. Rav will concede. What happened? You have half. Remember, you need that if the minority of the community follow the bezin, they are potter. But the bezin doesn't bring a carbon either. They don't bring that special bull. An individual brings a goat or a sheep, a kid or a but the bezin brings a par. But that they don't bring it if minority of people did it. Only the majority of the people did a mistake by relying on bezin. The bezin bring a par. What happens is half and half. And if you add the members of the bezin, it becomes a majority. So Marav is moida. So to be here as well. If this person forget about what it is about the business. That's just an example. If the person who ate thinking kosher fats turned out to be ate treif fats, you cannot add that person to the half and say, well, now we have a majority who ate treif fats because this person didn't really rely on the bezin. My time on my crop is goga. They all have to be the same shaking. So Teish has a chikira. What happens if the majority of the people, all of them, have the same shaking? But you know what the shaking was? They were eating kosher fats. That's what they thought. Turned out to be was treif fats. That the bezin paskin. Do we say in that case, well, it's all one shaykik, or do we say they weren't really relying on the bezin, and therefore, in that case, there the bezin does not bring a carbon? Case remains a good question. Okay, then we should continue. The bench also whether three scenarios. The first part of the mission is a case where you are potter because you follow the bezin, and the second part of the mission you are chayiv because you knew the bezin made a mistake. In all three, and both of them, it says whether you all did it together, whether you did it concurrently, whether you did it after, or whether you're the only one who did it. So it says the Gemara. I don't understand. What do you have to give me three examples? Bishlemeration, the first part of the mission where you're saying that you are chayiv, that you are potter, then loizu aziktani. The chiddush is building up. Now, what that even when you did, you're the only one who did it, you're still potter. El Seifa, the L'chiyuv and the Seifa where you knew they were wrong, and the Mishnah is telling you that you're chayiv. Then what do you mean if you're the only one who did it? Of course, then you're chayiv. The chiddush is that even if you all did it together, the order should have been reversed. The order should have been reversed. Sometimes we have a habit that we start off with something which is the biggest chiddush, and we're working our way down and saying that for sure, and then for sure this case, and for sure even this case as well. Then the Mishnah continues. If you have mentioned Torah, Talmud, if one of them knew the mistake, or a Talmud that qualifies to be in the bezin. Why does the Mishnah have to spell that out? It's quite obvious that if you knew they made a mistake, whether you're a member of the bezin or not, then you're not relying on the bezin anymore. You know that they're wrong. Tati Lomli, what to tell them both? Amar Rava says Rava. Itzich we need it. Something I would have thought, Hani Mili Gombe I would have thought that what's considered a qualified rabbi only you know all the halachas, plus you're very intelligent and you know how to draw parallels. But I will go on the subject. But if you know how to learn, but you don't know how to draw parallels, why? Then you be potter because just because you knew, you didn't really know. Abai says, the moment you say who's qualified to be a paisik, only someone not only he knows the Shulchan Aruch, but he knows how to draw parallels, he knows how to take the ideas from the principles and apply it in other situations. So when you say Talmud Torah, you're talking about Gomer v'Savir. So again, the question goes back: Echad Mehen or Talmud Torah is the same thing. Gomer v'Savir mashma the word Hara means Gomer v'Savir. No hachik. If it only said one, have a mirror thought. If it only said, for example, Echad Mehen, I would say okay. Gomer v'Savir, only somebody who can learn and he can draw parallels. I will Gomer v'Loisav, somebody who can learn but he cannot really understand so well. Then loy. Then that's not considered knowing, and therefore he would be part if he followed the bezin. But by the way, when we say bezin, we mean the Sanhedrin Gedolah. We're talking about only the bezin in Yerushalayim, the base Hagazis. We're talking about Lishchot Hagazis, only the top Sanhedrin. Other Bata didn't make this mistake; they don't qualify. So the mother. The fact that it says that it's an extra word, it teaches you that I feel a gomit. I don't care which way it is. Even if you're not a learner, but you don't know how to think. And according to some, it says now Gemara, if you understand, you should understood, even though you don't know halachas. Many Yisraelim take that out because you're smart, but if you don't know the halachas, how can you say that this person knew the bezin and made a mistake? Anyway, who's considered a man? Like, for example, who Amar against Shimon Nazish, we had in the first Pedic Sanhedrin, that those two, they never got smicha. And even though they were highly intelligent, and very interesting, all of these people didn't get smicha, all the first name of Shimon. And anyway, if there were such scholars, why you say they call them a shegi? If they knew Bezin made a mistake, you tell me that what? Therefore they bring the carbon. They should bring in a carbon. They knew it was a mistake. They're deliberate. So the Gemara asks back, well, time if you're going to be asking me that question, let me ask you a question. Time we learned, it says by Soisa, it says if you did an Aveda, it says O Lashon Yochid, it says Nefesh, Achas, Techter Bishgab, we'll come back to soon. By Soisa, and for you learn now that if a Yochid follows the Bezni's Potter, Yochid is answer Chayv. If you did on your own religion, you Chayv. But the Bezin, you follow Bezin Potter, Kates, what do you mean? Hoyd said the Braisa, Hoyd the Bezin, Shechel Mutter. The Bezin says that, well, that Trefer fat is Mutter, Venoid Lachem, and Lechem, and one of them knew, should totally made a mistake. Like Talmud Yoshim, a student was sitting before them, suitable for Paskin. He could go in, for example, it says clearly here, Shimon ben Azza, Yoch, I would have thought you Potter, I would have thought you Potter, Tamalain Basoisa. That what? Acha, single Yochid, is up here, if you did it on your own, you're Chai, but here's Bezni Potter, you follow Bezni Potter. Now, so the says clearly here, Shimon ben Azza is Chai, but Carbon didn't rely on Bezni. Nu, how could it be? Kigoyin the Yoda, the Osir. So more answer. You know why he's a shaygig? He knew that was Osir. But the Kotor, he made a mistake. The mitzvah l'shmoya divrei chacham. How far do we go when we say mitzvah l'shmoya? Actually, last week, Pasha Rashi says, even if they tell you the shayfet in your city tells you, you mean smoil or smoil, you mean that the right is left, left is right, you have to follow him. So you think that even if it's openly against the Torah, they say that trefa fats is kosher, maybe you should follow them as well. How far do we go? So that was the shaygig. And therefore, you can't say I relied on the Sanhedrin, whatever, I should be potter from covering altogether because you knew that they were wrong, but you made a mistake in another din, which they didn't instruct you about, and that is, should you follow Chachamim when they make a mistake? That's your mistake. This is the rule. The rule is, if you tell the ba'atzma yichayv. Lasuye mai. What do you mean? What's the mission adding? That if you did it on your own volition, you're chayv. We already told you that. Somebody who generally, the rabbis, he never listens to the rabbanim. He's constantly mocking them. He's very cynical. And suddenly now he said, the rabbis are saying something which I like. I'm going to follow them. That person, you cannot say you're relying on the rabbanim. That person, that's what the Mishnah teaches you. The only reason why is because they're agreeing with you, not you're agreeing with them. And therefore, that is not counted as you're following Horayos Bezin. And the next part, the Mishnah says, but if you're relying on the Bezin, then you are Potter. So you might to add what? Horayos Bezin. What happened? This comes down to the following. What happened? Bezin Paskin, that Trefa fats is kosher, and they made a proclamation everywhere. And then a week later, they realized they made a mistake and they retracted. But you did not find out that they retracted. So you went ahead and you ate the Trefa fats, thinking that rule still applies. The Yodu should told the Chosba, the Bezin retracted. And the Kiddush in the Mishnah is that since, even though the Bezin is no longer maintaining that psak, but because you did it, because of what they said, you are potter. That's why the Mishnah says that atoila b'da bebezin, you're potter. So the Gemara Beheti Tana says in the later Mishnah. So you must be right. Tani v'hadim afadish. First, our Mishnah gives a rule, and then the next Mishnah goes in detail, as we'll see. Says the Gemara that you should know that our Mishnah is not agreed by everybody. Our Mishnah says that the rule is that if the minority of the people follow the bezin, then our Mishnah said they are potter from a carbon, and everyone agrees that the bezin also is potter from a carbon. When does the bezin have to bring a carbon? Only if the majority of the people are made a mistake. So, but the minority of the people, our Mishnah holds the bezin that taka doesn't bring a carbon, but neither do you. Neither do you, because you rely on the bezin, and that is not going to be so simple. Shmuel comes along and says, "I'm even Shmuel. Zu divid Rabbi Yehuda. Our Mishnah, the words Rabbi Yehuda. Our Chachamim disagree. They hold that since the bezin will not be bringing a carbon, then the yachid has to bring a carbon. That when do we say that if you follow the bezin, you are potter? Only if it's the majority of the people. Because since the bezin will be bringing a carbon, so that's an atonement for you as well. Chacham say yachid she'asa b'hayras bezin chayiv. If a yachid follows the hayras bezin, you're chayiv. My Rabbi Yehuda, which Rabbi Yehuda is this? So Gemara explains. Time we learned. Even if it says in the pasuk, and we had in Gemara Shabbos, it says there are three words written here singular. Nefesh, that's one. And ach, it says, as if you read nefesh sechte, acha sechte, and these are two dinim regarding Shabbos. We learned over there that in order to be chai for carrying, you have to lift it, akira, carry it across the boundaries, that's haitzah, and then hanocha, placing it down. If you did only part of it, someone else did the other part of it, you are potter, because it says that yochid only if you did the entire Veda. And from the word achad, we learn out that shnaim shazu, two people do it concurrently. Since they yochel, each one could, according to at least, if each one could have done it on their own, you are potter. We learn from the word achas. And then what do we learn from the word ba'asaisa? That if nothing to do with Shabbos, that if you did it on your own, you're chai. But if you did it because the bezin told you, you are potter. In other words, you are potter even though the bezin won't be bringing a carbon if they gave the wrong sack. Is a oise me pi atzmei chayiv, but it's bezin potter. Well, bezin you're potter. My rabbana. So who's the rabbana argue? You tell me that the other people will say that since the bezin will not be bringing a carbon by a minority, you're not exempt, and you need to bring a carbon. Where do we find such opinion?